사당 오락, 4시간 자면 붓고 5시간 자면 떨어진다. 공부나 일은 역시 오랫동안 엉덩이를 붙이고 앉아있는 사람이 결국 좋은 성과를 내게 되어 있다. 우리가 어렸을 때부터 수도 없이 듣고 자란 말들이에요. 만약 세상이 진짜 그렇게 돌아간다면 세상은 참 공평하겠죠. 가장 오래 앉아서 공부한 학생이 가장 높은 성적을 내고 좋은 대학에 갈 것이고, 가장 오래 앉아서 많은 야근을 한 직원이 가장 높은 성과를 내고 높은 매출을 올릴 거예요. 하지만 세상을 살다 보면 자기가 노력을 한 만큼 꼭 성취가 나오지 않는다는 걸 알게 되죠. 그렇기 때문에 또 한편으로는 미국의 속담처럼 work smarter, not harder, 무조건 더 열심히 일할 게 아니라 더 똑똑하게 일해라 라는 말도 있고, 일종의 농담처럼 열심히 하면 뭐해? 잘 해야지! 이렇게 얘기하는 상사를 밈으로 만들기도 하죠. 도대체 어느 쪽이 맞는 걸까요? 여기에 대해서 통쾌한 해설한 책이 있어서 오늘 소개해드리려고 하는데요. 펜실베니아 대학의 조직심리학자로서 가장 성취를 많이 내는 사람의 특징을 오랫동안 연구해온 애덤그랜트 교수의 히든 포텐셜, 숨겨진 잠재력이라는 책이에요. 한국 사람들은 누구보다도 오래 열심히 끈질기게 일하는 것이 성공의 길이라는 것을 믿고 있는데, 마치 애덤그랜트 교수가 한국 사람들을 보면서 조금 더 과학적인 방법을 가미하면 더 큰 성취를 이룰 수 있지 않을까라고 안타까워서 쓴 책이라고 생각이 들 정도로 한국 사람들이 꼭 읽어야 되는 책이라고 생각해서 오늘 애덤그랜트 교수와의 인터뷰 진행해 보겠습니다. So I was reading Hidden Potential, which I'm sure you wrote with a US audience in mind, but I almost felt like you wrote it like specifically for South Koreans. The way I read your book was that it's basically a book about how to achieve excellence, whether in academia, whether in sports or in the arts. And the conventional wisdom on how to achieve excellence usually is, one, you have to be a perfectionist. You have to strive for perfection at all times. And you have to continue striving day and night, 24/7. You have to eat, sleep, and breathe it. It basically has to become your life. And nowhere in the world are those beliefs stronger, I believe, than in South Korea. So here you have kids who wake up 7 in the morning and stay in cramped schools until 11 at night if they want to get into good schools. They do homework until 1 in the morning. And in Korea, that's considered like how you succeed. And what was shocking as a Korean person reading your book was that you challenge these conventional wisdom head on and say, hey, perfectionism and obsession or overexertion is not only not productive, but it can actually be harmful to your development.
It's really interesting that you point that out, because you're right. I didn't sit down to write Hidden Potential for a South Korean audience. But in some ways, the seeds of this book were planted by conversations I had with a former student from Korea, Ji-hae Shin.
Oh, really? Wow.
Who's now at Yale. And Ji-hae years ago told me that she was basically raised to never procrastinate, that she was supposed to be focused and motivated at all times and aim for perfection. And if she ever got distracted, that was supposed to undermine her success. And yet, she told me that she had her most creative ideas when she was procrastinating. I challenged her to test it, and we ended up doing a whole bunch of research, including evidence from South Korean employees, showing that if you procrastinate somewhat, you actually end up getting rated as more creative by your supervisor. And then we did some experiments where we found that a little bit of procrastination can be helpful for incubating new ideas. But if you do it too much, you end up rushing ahead with your easiest idea, as opposed to being able to implement your best idea. And I think that in some ways was in the back of my mind when I was writing this book.
I found out on your bio, I don't know whether your birth year on Wikipedia page is accurate, that we're the same age. I was also born in 1981, and I also grew up in Michigan.
Where?
Suburb of East Lansing called Okemos.
Yeah, of course. I used to dive against the Okemos team. So
Oh,
we
really?
grew up
Wow.
about an hour apart.
Okay. I went to the US in part to escape from the pressure cooker that is Korean education system. And I had a great time in the US, and I became an advocate for not pushing kids too hard in their education. And that's how I started my career, in fact, as a public speaker. And then I read in your book and books of some of your colleagues, like NYU professor Jonathan Haidt, who say that American education is actually becoming more and more like East Asian education, or at least taking on some really bad parts of it. Could you point out some of the changes that's been going on in the American education system and some of the side effects that's beginning to show?
Yeah, I'm really worried about this too. I think probably one of the clearest trends is that kindergarten has become more and more like first grade in the US. I think when you and I were growing up in Michigan, in kindergarten, we spent a lot of time learning about the solar system. We were taught that Pluto was a planet, and obviously had to rethink that one. But I spent a lot of time, learning about outer space, studying dinosaurs, playing outside in recess. And now kindergartners are spending much more time learning to write letters that they can't even read yet, having to sit still all day, not getting outside as much. I think that's a huge mistake because the evidence is clear that even if you want to just predict how successful a student is in school at age 16, if you want to predict their grades, for example, one of the best predictors is whether they enjoy school at age 6, 10 years earlier. I think the most important thing we can do when kids start school is to teach them that learning is fun. And that's what cultivates intrinsic motivation. That's what stimulates curiosity. And I think you're right. I think we're going backward. I think, of course, we also want to teach grit and hard work. But one of the things we know is that intrinsic motivation actually drives those habits. When you're passionate about what you do and you're drawn to it because you're excited to learn, you not only work hard, but the quality of your learning improves.
When I was young, it was common parlance among Korean parents that if you sleep 3 hours a day, you become a doctor. If you sleep 4 hours a day, you drop out.
Wow.
And this was a common, a motivational phrase that kids who are preparing for college entrance would scribble on their wall to help them keep awake and things like that. And this attitude carries over also into workplace. So Korea is officially the most sleep-deprived country in the world. And we have the longest working hour among any developed nation. So a lot of Korean people have such an ingrained notion of what efficiency looks like. Like you have to be driven all the time. That when they travel to Europe and they see French people, they are so relaxed and casual about their work. How do these people get anything done? And then, they read the surprising statistics published by Korean newspapers, like an average French worker creates $68 of wealth per hour, whereas an average Korean worker creates $40 of wealth an hour. And then they get really confused.
There's a quality quantity trade-off that we all run into at some point. I do not know any human brain that's capable of high quality focused attention for 100 hours a week. I don't believe it's humanly possible. There may be a few exceptions, but in the data, it is extremely rare. So what you see is after people have focused for a period of, let's say, 3 or 4 hours, the quality of their attention goes down. And at that point, they start to make more errors. They start to have fewer creative ideas. And ultimately, that compromises the value that they produce. I think we ought to know this. We've all lived it. Think about the day when you felt the most burned out. How good were you that day compared to a day when you really felt energized? I think, though, that there's a misconception. I've heard this from quite a few Korean colleagues in particular, that we should try to become more like machines. And the problem is that we're not wired to work that way. A lot of people believe that productivity is just the volume that you create. And I don't think that's the right way to think about productivity. I think about productivity as the value you produce. Ultimately, if you want to produce the most value, you need to treat both your mind and your body in a way that prepares you to do that. And in so many fields, that just doesn't happen. So you mentioned musicians, for example. The research on elite international concert pianists shows that they do not practice more than 3 to 4 hours per day. So I had this vision suggesting, my mental model of a great piano player is you're doing scales 14 hours a day. No, they're not. I had a great conversation with Yo-Yo Ma about this on my Rethinking podcast, where he said in his 20s, he burned out trying to practice that way. And not only did he exhaust himself, but he wasn't as effective as a cellist. And he decided he needed to really pare back his practice to try to put in the best possible time instead of the most possible time. You can see it with athletes too. The athletes who are constantly pounding the pavement are at greater risk for physical injury and also for emotional exhaustion, which then prevents them from reaching their full potential. So I think there's an argument to be made here. Open question is whether people are going to be receptive to it.
운동을 하는 사람들은 이 아이러니에 대해서 전부터 알고 있었던 것 같아요. 하루에 6시간 동안 근력 운동하면 오히려 근손실이 일어난다. 그렇기 때문에 적정한 힘과 적정한 길이로 운동을 하고 휴식과 영양에도 신경을 써야 돼서 밸런스를 맞춰야 된다는 얘기가 한 20년 전부터 누구나 알고 있는 얘기였습니다. 하지만 우리가 사무직이나 또는 공부에 관련해서는 아직도 옛날의 통념, 오랫동안 엉덩이 무겁게 책상 앞에 앉아서 끊임없이 노력하는 사람이 곧 성공한다는 것을 버리지 못하고 있어요.
Another result of the education system that we have that constantly pushes kids to have perfect score brings us to second thing that you talk about in your book, which is how perfectionism is actually detrimental to performance. So in Korea, we see this a lot because we've been trained since, let's say, first grade until we graduate high school to be punished for every mistake we make and be rewarded for every perfect score we get. So the kind of adult we become is the kind of adult that's afraid to speak unless we are 100% sure that it's going to be received well by our colleagues. Kind of adult that's afraid to implement any idea that we're not sure is going to work 100%. And you say that this is exactly opposite of people who are improving their potential, the kind of people who are actually most effective.
I do say that, and I even believe it. So this is the research of Thomas Curran, who's a psychologist in the United Kingdom. What Tom and his colleagues have found is that first of all, the way to build a perfectionist as a parent is to set unrealistically high, maybe impossible expectations for your kids, and then criticize them extremely harshly when they don't live up to those expectations. And what that cultivates in children is a belief that if they're flawed, that they're worthless, and they become afraid of failure. Well, what happens when you start to feel failure? A few things happen if you track the evidence. One thing that happens is you only do things that you know you're going to succeed at, which means that if you initially struggle at a skill or a task, you just give up. If I am initially not good at playing a musical instrument, well, I don't want to be a failure, so I'm going to quit right away and find something that I can ace. So that's limiting, obviously, because many people end up becoming great at tasks that they initially started out poor at. Secondly, you end up constantly beating yourself up for falling short of your expectations. And that again becomes a recipe for burnout. When you finish a project and you only got a 98 and you really wanted 100, you feel like you're a disaster and your life is over. That can lead to anxiety, depression, self-harm. The list of things that perfectionism predicts that are bad is pretty long. And then number three, what we see is that perfectionists do perform better in school, but they don't actually achieve more at work. I think this is just a fundamental difference between the way that schools are structured and the way that the world of work is organized. In school, if you're a perfectionist, you can more or less figure out what's going to be on the exam and then prepare to do as well as possible. But then you get into the real world and there is no exam. When there is a test, nobody tells you exactly what's going to be on it. And so perfectionists tend to focus very narrowly on mastering the things that they can practice over and over again and repeat them until they perfect them. And they don't end up exercising their creative muscles. They don't learn to take risks. And that ultimately prevents them from being good problem solvers. I think that when we teach kids to be perfectionists, they become very good at solving well-structured problems. What they don't learn to do is find problems. So they know how to give answers. They don't know how to ask questions. And I think that does a real disservice to kids, especially in a world where the rise of generative AI tools like ChatGPT or Claude has made it easier and easier to just have not only the information you want at your fingertips, but also to be able to communicate that information to other people. I think increasingly advantage is going to come to people who have the ability to not only answer questions, but actually ask good questions.
And one of the reasons that I think that as a generation, the millennials and are we millennials, by the way? Are we millennials or Gen X?
I think there's a debate about this. We're kind of on the border, but by my count, we're the youngest Gen Xers.
Okay, I think so. I think I feel more comfortable hanging out with Gen Xers than proper millennials, whatever that means. In any case, I think the millennials and Gen Z are more perfectionist because of the technological environment they grew up in. Because of this social media environment, I think it's really harder for the younger generation to come out and say, okay, I'm just going to, even if I'm not perfect yet, like if I'm not perfect in speaking French yet, I'm just going to make a video, Instagram Reels in French, because they know that there's going to be so much hate, so many negative comments. How do you advise your students to get over this fear of cyberbullying, being ridiculed online, being, fossilized online, and get that courage to go out there and make mistakes?
I think the question is an important one. And I do want to caveat that I think that social media has probably contributed to the rise in perfectionism. When it's not helpful to know that your actions could be immortalized when you're learning and when you're taking risks. It's also not helpful to see, only the best version of everybody that shows up online. That being said, I think in the current data, it's pretty clear that perfectionism started rising a whole generation before social media existed. And that is predicted. This is in the US, in the UK, and in Canada by the rise in high parental expectations and extreme parental harsh criticism. And that in turn seems to be because the world got more competitive. It's harder and harder to get into a university today than it was when we were growing up. And so parents felt like they had to push their kids to be that much better in order to give them a shot, not realizing the damage they were doing to kids. And I think against that backdrop, knowing that I might be embarrassed and ridiculed by everyone in my school or everyone on the internet if I make a mistake has only magnified the problems. So what do we do with that? I think there are a few options. The first one is to say, look, you don't actually have to share your mistakes publicly. Wait until you've achieved some success before you take people backstage. I think that's the first thing I would say. Second thing that I've talked with a lot of students about is, what if we actually change the standard by which we judge people? What if we judge them not just by the outcome they reach, but also by the progress they've made? So yeah, I think one of the healthier versions of this trend that I've seen on social media is people posting like getting in shape trajectories, right? So you see somebody post, way out of shape, overweight, clearly have not exercised in a while photo. And they're saying, look, here's where I am right now. And I want to use this as motivation to try to improve. And then you watch their arc. And 6 months later, they look like professional bodybuilders. I don't know that that's the ideal that we all want to aspire to. But I think it's a really good example of admiring somebody for the distance they traveled, as opposed to just the place they're in. And I think we could apply more of that logic to mistake making. So with language learning, for example, instead of criticizing somebody for making a mistake, let's ask, how much did they improve over the past month? And we know that the more of those mistakes you make when you're learning a new language, the better you get, because it means that you're using the language more. So we want to celebrate that. We want to applaud that, as opposed to attacking and shaming it.
One of the things that I found interesting, having experience studying at a university, was that you guys actually read all the student feedback that we write at the end of the semester. And, when we write like mean things about the professors we've had, we never think about the fact that the person who's reading it is actually a live human being with feelings and anxieties and complexes. I never thought about that. I started doing YouTube to do, in fact, what you say in Hidden Potential, to teach things that I haven't mastered yet in order to get better. So I was really into like European and American history. So I created this YouTube channel originally to talk about obscure historical background of famous novels or films. And then I would get comments, like you get student comments that you talk about in your book. I would get comments from people who either know a lot more than me about European or American history. They would usually something like, I'm here to put you in your place. Or people who read some Wikipedia page and think they know better than me, but they actually don't. If I put all the negative comments together, I think I could categorize them into two camps. So there were some comments that actually made me angry, and that anger motivated me. Like, oh, that guy doesn't know what I'm talking about. So next time I'm going to do more research, read more books, get more facts straight. I'm going to show you that I'm actually qualified to do this. But there are other comments that I found so degrading or humiliating that I just wanted to give up. I'm like, why am I making these YouTube videos? So you describe in your book that the impact of negative comment can be constructive or destructive depending on who it comes from. Could you explain?
Yeah, this is a really good illustration of Samir Nur Mohammed's research on underdog motivation. So the basic idea is that if you get criticized by somebody who's an expert and you respect their opinion, it can be really deflating and demoralizing, because you say, look, this person thinks I have no potential. They know what they're talking about. So why am I doing this? Clearly, this is not the right role for me. If, on the other hand, the person who's attacking you is ignorant, that can fire you up. And that's when you want to prove them wrong. And you say, hey, wait a minute, you don't know what you're talking about. I'll show you. And you end up working harder to try to demonstrate, in fact, that you are capable. And I think the opportunity to reframe this is to say, okay, is that person your intended audience? Are they the audience you're trying to reach? I think the answer is no. I think it's worth remembering that not all critics are thinking critically. Not all critics are speaking constructively. And I think if you go in, this applies, not just to social media, but any kind of work that you're creating. If you go in and you have a clear idea of your intended audience, it becomes much easier, to have thick skin when people poke you. So I always want to think about going in. This is true when I write a book. It's true when I launch a podcast season. It's even true sometimes when I just do a random social media post for Twitter or Instagram. I want to start by asking whose opinions matter to me. I'm definitely going to get some strong reactions to anything I post these days, even something that I think is pretty obvious. So there are people who are going to violently disagree with it. So who am I actually trying to reach here? And when the criticism inevitably comes, which critics am I going to listen to? I like to ask 3 questions on that. The first question is, how knowledgeable is this person? Do they have relevant expertise or experience? If the answer is yes, I'm going to pay a lot more attention than if the answer is no. Second question is, how familiar are they with me and my capabilities? The better they know me, the more I respect their judgment of me. And then number 3, are they actually trying to help me get better? Do they care about improving the argument or enriching the idea, or are they just trying to look smart and make someone else feel stupid? If I do that in advance, it's a lot easier than when the attacks come to say, that person doesn't meet any of my criteria, so I'm not going to give their diatribe the time of day.
That's a great advice. I'll remember that next time. Every time before I upload a new video, I remind myself of what you said. I think that's a very helpful advice. Thank you. You advocate in order to unlock your hidden potential that you have to be willing to make mistakes and you have to take the chance of looking like you're not trying hard, right? Because you got to take breaks and you got to pace your repetitions and things like that. But that's not entirely up to you, right? I mean, if you live in a culture where if you are resting, people are like, oh, you're a slacker. So you constantly have to look busy. I know that's true of Korea, but I also know that's true of the American culture where people take great pride in the fact that they have 3 cell phones and they're flipping Bitcoin with 1 cell phone and hustling real estate with another cell phone. They make videos showing off how busy they are. And if you are in a corporate environment or elite universities like UPenn, where everybody's take great pride in being intelligent, being smart, and there's a real competition to say smart things and you don't want to look stupid, right? If you're in those environments, it's really, really hard to say, okay, I'm going to learn by making mistakes and I don't mind looking like a slacker. There's a lot of social pressure. And this is my key question. Let's say if you're a teacher or a manager or a parent who has charge of a small group of people, or you're not necessarily the president of the country, you're not necessarily the CEO who can do a organization-wide culture change. But let's say you are a teacher in charge of 15 kids, or you're a parent in charge of raising 2 or 3 children. What would you do in an environment where there's so much social pressure to be perfectionist, to create an environment where people that you're in charge of feel safe making mistake or taking a break?
Well, I think the best thing you can do, and this is true whether you're a leader or a teacher or a parent, is to model that behavior. I did an experiment a few years ago with Konstantinos Koutiferis, where we asked leaders in multiple organizations to ask how they could get better. And the hope was that would open the door for people to speak up, that their teams would feel more psychologically safe to admit mistakes and point out problems and share concerns. And it was not enough. What was more effective was when we randomly assigned some of those leaders to criticize themselves out loud, to talk about the mistakes they'd made, to share their weaknesses, to open up about their own areas for development and growth. And we found that when managers did that psychological safety, as Amy Edmondson defines it, that sense that I can speak up without fear, that I can take a risk and make a mistake without being punished, it went up in the teams for at least a year. And I think that as a leader, when you admit your own flaws, you're not just claiming that you're not going to punish people for making mistakes, right? You're actually proving it by owning up to your own mistakes. I think the same thing is true for leaders and parents, right? I think my wife and I have actually had some great discussions with our kids over dinner where we ask our kids, what's the one thing we can do better as parents? And we talk about our own parenting mistakes. And we're obviously trying to open the door for our kids to give us feedback and to learn from our children. but we're also trying to demonstrate to them that we're not perfect. And we know we make mistakes. I know there are times when I'm impatient. I know there are times when I'm distracted and I get sucked into my phone, or I'm focused on a task and I don't pay as much attention as I would like. And the only way I can improve on that is to start by admitting it. I think a lot of people, and this is particularly true in South Korea, are afraid to admit those mistakes for the reasons that you're describing. I think that they don't want to be judged negatively. But I think there are two things I would suggest to counter that. The first one is that if we can do it in the US, you can definitely do it in Korea, because humility is prized in your culture, right? In the US, people tend to be much more narcissistic. And so this is a little bit countercultural to, admit that there's anything wrong with you. Whereas I know if you look at Korean cultural norms, people are supposed to be modest. They're supposed to be self-effacing. They're not supposed to act superior. It can actually be easier in some ways to talk about your shortcomings and your flaws. My second point is the people who are close to you, your children, your close friends, your extended family members, your colleagues, your employees, guess what? They already know what you're bad at. You can't hide it from them. So you might as well get credit for having the self-awareness to see your weaknesses and the humility and the integrity to admit them out loud. And when you do that, other people begin to believe that it's safe to be imperfect too.
오늘 인터뷰에서 가장 와닿은 두 가지 내용을 정리해보자면, 하나는 첼리스트 요요마에 관련된 내용 같아요. 가장 노력과 연습의 길이가 중시되는 것 중에 하나가 음악이죠. 하지만 요요마도 하루 종일 연습을 할 때 자기가 오히려 실력이 늘지 않아서 연습 시간을 줄여봤더니 자기 능력이 비약적으로 상승하고 결국 지금의 위대한 첼리스트가 됐다라는 이야기. 즉, 모든 사람에게는 자기한테 맞는 최적의 연습 시간 또는 공부하는 시간이 있지, 옆 사람이 7시간 공부해서 성공했다 그래서 나도 7시간 동안 집중력을 유지할 수 있는 사람이 아닐 수도 있다는 거. 이게 저는 굉장히 중요한 얘기라고 생각을 했고요. 두 번째는 사람은 기계가 아니다라는 말이었어요. 산업혁명 시대에 이 기계가 도입되면서 이 공장의 메타포로 인간의 생산력도 이야기를 하기 시작했죠. 기계는 매시간 똑같은 양을 생산하기 때문에 10시간 돌릴 기계를 더 많은 연료를 들여서 15시간을 돌리면은 당연히 50%의 생산력 향상이 일어났겠죠. 그렇기 때문에 인간도 똑같이 더 오랜 시간 일을 할 수 있으면 같은 레벨의 성과가 그 시간만큼 더 나올 거라는 사고방식을 가지게 됐다는 거예요. 하지만 인간은 기계가 아니기 때문에 먹고 자고 숨쉬고 인간과의 교류도 필요하고 자기의 동기부여도 필요한 하나의 생명체로서 존중을 할 때 뛰어난 성과의 길이 보인다라는 내용이 우리 시대에 꼭 필요한 메시지라고 생각했습니다. 오늘 조승연의 탐구생활은 여기서 마무리하고요. 다음엔 더 재밌는 문화 역사 이야기로 찾아뵙겠습니다. 안녕히 계십시오.